I want to welcome to the program Adam Weinstein. He's a research fellow at the Quincy Institute, focuses on security, trade, rule of law in Afghanistan and Pakistan, veteran of the Marine Corps and the war in Afghanistan. Adam, welcome to the show. I'm here with Emma Vigeland.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So let's just start with where we're at. Joe Biden had announced, maybe it was a month ago, maybe it was a little longer, that we would be, that we were not going to make the May deadline, but that we were going to be pulling out of Afghanistan before 9/11, unconditionally so. My understanding is that timetable has been sped up by the military anyways.
Well, I think the timetable that President Biden announced was a rough estimate to give the military enough time, but they found that they were able to do it quicker. And of course, there is an incentive to do it quicker rather than draw it out, I think.
What would that incentive be?
Well, I think the longer you draw out the withdrawal, the more risk there is to the remaining U.S. troops, risk of attack, things like that. So I think once the decision was made, there was a motivation on the part of the Pentagon to get folks out as quickly as possible.
So I'm sorry, what is the status now?
Well, DOD doesn't announce exact figures of how like what percentage they're at. They give ranges, and the last range I heard was approximately 25%. But again, that was about a week ago, so I suspect it's a little bit more now.
And from your perspective, what makes this withdrawal, which we've seen announcements before this, what makes this different?
Well, I think what makes this different is that they're closing down major bases. You saw that they withdrew U.S. troops from Kandahar airfield. They appear to be closing down Bagram. So these are giant military installations versus what we saw in the past was these military installations remained intact and the number of U.S. troops was lowered. But now we see the United States handing over its major military installations to the Afghan security forces, which we haven't seen that before.
What are the Afghan security forces? To what extent can they? I mean, give us an assessment of their ability, I guess, and really what they're, what is it that we obviously they defend the Afghani government, right? But I mean, what do you imagine is their how are they going to approach this? What is their purpose at this point, and how well will they be able to use those bases? I mean, because the real question here seems to be, at what point does the Taliban take over Afghanistan?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Taliban have captured a few key districts around Kabul, which is the capital, but not in, around provinces that encircle the capital, but they haven't, I don't think they have the ability to take major provincial capitals just yet. It's to be seen how the Afghan security forces, prevail or don't prevail. They've had some successes and they've had a lot of failures. There are plenty of outposts that have been overrun, but the special forces and even some of the conventional forces have been able to thwart Taliban attacks. They lack the technical capacity that the United States provided. For example, there's a lot of questions about whether they'll be able to maintain their helicopters or continue flying them without the United States and without contractors. But on the other hand, I think the real question is going to be, is there a resolve to fight? And does the leadership of the Afghan security forces, fragment or not? Because you could also make the argument that with the withdrawal of U.S. troops, there will be greater resolve to fight because they can't rely on the United States anymore. So I think, I guess the conventional wisdom would say that the Taliban are slowly going to gain territory, and ultimately a future government of Afghanistan will be Taliban dominated. But I don't think that's what's going to happen in the short term, as in a year out from now. And I don't think that's set in stone. I just think that's the safe bet, but it's not for certain.
So give us a sense of if 25% have been drawn down, and the original figure, at least at the time of the announcement, was about 2,500 U.S. troops. We're at, I don't know, and then another week, maybe we're at 1,500 troops, 1,700 troops, somewhere around there that are still in. once those 1,700 are out of country, they have officially handed over these bases to Afghan security forces. Who remains in the country that is not, well, or that has been in there under the, under the auspices of this war that has been fought for 20 years?
Well, I mean, for example, Turkey, if I understand your question correct, I mean, Turkey is going to be managing the Kabul airport. They took on that responsibility. And of course, that airport is critical to the continued functioning of the Afghan government and even the Afghan security forces. So there will be a Turkish presence there. It remains to be seen whether US contractors will stay in some capacity or not. Right now, it appears as if they're leaving, but who knows? Obviously, Pakistan, Iran, Russia, India, these regional countries will always have some influence in Afghanistan. So, I mean, there's going to be non-Afghan actors that are inside Afghanistan, but I think it's going to be significantly reduced, and we're going to see what happens in an Afghanistan that that doesn't have NATO troops there.
So the NATO troops, Turkey is there under the auspices of NATO, and is that it for the NATO complement of troops? Just Turkey at the airport?
As far as I'm not aware of all of the inside planning, but the major contingents of NATO troops, such as the Germans, the Italians, they're leaving. So Turkey agreed to provide security for the airport and run it, essentially, manage it. And so we'll see. I mean, perhaps it's not correct to say they're even providing security. They're essentially just managing the airport and ensuring that it remains functioning.
And again, on contractors, we are not leaving. There supposedly will be no American contractors there.
Yes, supposedly there'll be no contractors, but then again, I think that's a bit of a gray area, because we saw that some of these contracts for the contractors extend beyond the withdrawal deadline. But if you listen to some of the congressional hearings and some of the administration's testimony, it appears that the US contractors are leaving, but perhaps some of the money that the United States provides to the Afghan government can be used for other contractors, for example, contractors from Eastern Europe, as an example. So I don't think there's going to be an end to contractors. I think there's going to be an end to American contractors. And of course, I'll believe it when I see it.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, there's a piece in the New York Times today about the CIA being concerned about some sort of black hole of intelligence once there's a troop withdrawal, right? So, I mean, I'm just curious, what kind of intelligence infrastructure do you think remains?
Well, it's going to be diminished. I mean, that piece was talking about how the United States is in negotiations with Pakistan to possibly use a base inside Pakistan or create a base or whatever arrangement they come to. And then, the United States is still looking at Central Asian countries. But I think the intelligence gathering capacity will be diminished. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be diminished, but when you have US troops on the ground, or you have a commando raid and they detain folks, they pick up what's sometimes referred to as pocket litter, the USB drives, the notes, the phones, anything you might find that could be used to disrupt a terror network like Al-Qaeda. That human intelligence capacity is going to be diminished. It's my personal belief that keeping US troops in Afghanistan for that purpose, when you do a balancing test, it makes more sense to withdraw. I don't think that the costs of staying in Afghanistan are worth whatever benefit and intelligence generating that we get. But objectively speaking, there will be a reduction in that intelligence capacity.
I want to circle back to that cost benefit analysis, just get a sense of what the costs are associated with it. But how is it? I'm reading that same Times piece, and apparently CIA Chief Burns is in Pakistan. We know that Pakistan is not going to jeopardize the Taliban, at least the Taliban that they have the best relationship with. It's possible there could be some elements of the Taliban that they decide are no longer useful to them. How is it that, when Biden first made this announcement, we kept hearing there was going to be, what is it, a response within the horizon or something, where people could, where, our special ops or whatnot could get into the country and supposedly have the ability to sort of wage some form of covert warfare. How is it that the CIA, and I'm not saying that they should, I'm quite happy. I would be quite happy if I felt like they had no ability in that country whatsoever. But how is it after 20 years, they don't have a plan B other than us being there? I mean, is that credulous? I mean, I mean, that just seems unlikely to me.
Well, I think a more accurate way to put it would be they have a plan A that they want to do, and they're begrudgingly doing their plan B. I think the Pentagon and the intelligence community is, they sometimes they don't plan for things they don't want to do. Other analysts have made that point, and I think it's a valid point. They're used to getting their way over the last 20 years. I think some folks in the Pentagon might be surprised at the course of action the Biden administration has taken, and certainly perhaps in the intelligence community. So do I think they don't have a plan B? No, I think they have a plan B. I just think it's not the plan B that they want, but there's deep relationships, especially between the intelligence community and Pakistan and in the United States. And even when relations between Pakistan and the United States are dysfunctional, those ties between the two respective intelligence communities have always remained. And I think there's a lot more cooperation than is probably seen on the surface. And there are a lot of non-state actors and terrorist groups that both countries prioritize. Al-Qaeda, ISIS in Khorasan province, which is the South Asian version of ISIS, and TTP, which is the Pakistani Taliban, which the Pakistani state does challenge. They might see differently on the Afghan Taliban, but this has been one of or perhaps the crux of why we weren't able to achieve the outcomes we wanted in Afghanistan. It's not so much that Pakistan wants the war in Afghanistan to continue. Pakistan would rather see a stable Afghanistan, and the United States would rather see a stable Afghanistan, but it's a matter of the ordering of preferences, where Pakistan would rather see an unstable Afghanistan that's not friendly with India than a stable Afghanistan that is friendly with India. And very early on in the war, when the United States was backing the Northern Alliance, that really shook the Pakistanis because the Northern Alliance had a close relationship with India. And the government that emerged after the US invasion, of course, to this day has a close relationship with India. I think Pakistan inflates that threat, but perception is reality in international relations to some degree. And from the Pakistani perspective, they'd rather have an unstable Afghanistan than one that they view as aligned with India. So it's an ordering of preferences issue where Pakistan and the United States has never been on the same page about the Afghan government or the Afghan Taliban. But now that US troops are leaving, the priorities change for Washington. They don't care about the Taliban or state building so much. Now they care about terrorism. And when it comes to counterterrorism, Pakistan and the United States perhaps have more interests in common than some would like to admit. And so I think the backup plan for the intelligence community in the US will be to use some of these regional relationships to continue a CT war. Of course, they might have a more ridiculous backup plan, which I also saw reported, which was to basically back local militia leaders in Afghanistan to continue to have access to the country. I think that would be missing the forest for the trees and creating a very destabilizing situation for the sake of having access.
What other players? I mean, what other players have strong interest there, and how do they play out in that order of preference? I mean, so if I hear you correctly, you're saying that from the United States perspective, combined with Pakistan's perspective, the thing they can agree on is, look, if you need to have a incredibly repressive regime there to feel safe, because you can be sure that they're not going to be have a relationship with India, what we need from you is just some type of mechanism or guarantee that we're not going to have international terrorists from there. And as long as as long as we don't have that problem, we won't interfere with your problem. And, ultimately it's just the Afghani people will suffer more, but that is that seems to be like what happens with Afghanistan, is that all these major players come in and the people there are just basically chum. What is there another major player who is also involved in this calculation, or is it, or are those the United States and Pakistan the two? Does everything drop off from there in terms of like influence?
Yeah, I mean, I think you paraphrased it quite well, and really bluntly, I mean, that is the situation. I think the United States and Pakistan are the two most relevant outside players when it comes to the future of Afghanistan and the current situation. Russia matters, India matters, Iran matters, and many, again, some of this dysfunction perhaps will be reduced when U.S. troops leave. For example, Iran would rather see a stable Afghanistan that doesn't have a government with the Taliban in control. But so long as U.S. troops were going to be in Afghanistan, the Iranians were perfectly happy to give a little bit of support to the Taliban to sort of keep the Americans on their toes. So some of this dysfunction that played out was precisely because U.S. troops were in the country. Doesn't mean that when the U.S. troops withdraw that things will necessarily change for the better for Afghanistan, certainly not in the near term. I think you're right that Afghans are going to be the ones that suffer as these different countries play out proxy conflicts with one another in Afghanistan. But I think there is an opportunity here where all of these countries, China, Iran, Russia, the United States, Pakistan, have terrorism concerns. All of them none of them want a raging civil war next door if they can avoid it, that has spillover potential. And perhaps if the United States is willing to engage in aggressive diplomacy, it can avoid some of the worst consequences of the situation on the ground. I don't see a situation playing out where the Taliban don't end up being a very powerful force within the Afghan government. I think in a best case scenario, you get a political settlement where the Taliban have substantial power, and in another scenario, the Taliban take power through fighting and over time gaining significant territory. And there might be pockets of resistance that remain outside Taliban control, but they end up getting the majority of the country. And in an absolute worst case scenario, you just have a civil war that rages for another decade, and everything that comes with that.
Well, I read, I guess it was today, maybe, or sometime in the past couple of days, that the U.S. has earmarked over $200 million to the Afghan government, which on a day that Jeff Bezos announces he's going to, I don't know, go to the moon in his own private rocket worth billions of dollars, just seems almost laughable. Like, it's almost hard to imagine that somebody said, let's write up a press release about this for $200 million after everything that we've done to that country. But I also read a roundtable that you had in January. I don't know if you actually convened it in person or how you did it Zoom, but it reads as if it's a roundtable with Afghanis who were talking about the various possibilities for peace. And the one thing that that really struck me, and I can't recall who it was that said it, that there is a feeling that if there was no outside influence, that the Afghanis as a people would figure out some type of power sharing, whether it was regional, tribal, or whatnot, that would create an equilibrium, which might, prevent any sort of major conflict. What are the prospects for that? I mean, is there not something that we could do to provide Pakistan with some sense of security so that they don't have to provide so much support for the Taliban, so that there would be some, feeling that the Taliban needs to make, some type of like relatively quiet peace? Or is there just too many interests there and too much, I guess, money to be made in conflict?
Well, the analyst in me says that it's not going to happen because there's too many interests. But perhaps the part of me that thinks the United States should still be proactive in diplomacy says that, well, at least we can try, and not try militarily, but try through diplomacy, and other types of leverage. I mean, I think another thing in that roundtable that folks said was that there needed to be a more decentralized government. I think it's true that without outside influence, Afghans would probably find some kind of equilibrium with one another, and it would be less violent. But that's not the reality for Afghanistan. In many ways, it's functioning as a rentier state. Its armed forces are completely reliant on US funding. Its economy is completely reliant on aid. It's a country that it's an inconvenient truth, but will always, to some degree, be living in the shadow of Pakistan, at least for the foreseeable future, because Pakistan is such a larger country and has a more powerful military, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know that the United States can truly alter Pakistan's calculation when it comes to Afghan Taliban. Some folks have said, well, label them a state sponsor of terrorism or use all these sanctions. Sanctions haven't really worked in the past to influence their behavior. I think we saw it didn't really work with Iran. The maximum pressure campaign didn't work with Iran. I don't know why we'd replicate it with Pakistan. The United States is not going to label Pakistan a state sponsor of terrorism because, for the simple matter that the United States is not going to turn a nuclear power with what is it? I don't know the exact count, but nearly 300 million people into a pariah state just for the future of Afghanistan. This is not going to happen. It's not about what's fair or what's right. It's about realpolitik, and that's not going to happen. With some of the tools the U.S. has, such as perhaps assuring Pakistan that it's not going to invite India, the United States won't invite India to have a huge role in post-withdrawal Afghanistan, or that, hey, Pakistan, if you want us to, perhaps make sure you don't get on the FATF blacklist, which is a blacklist for countries that have illicit financing. Things like this, there's little carrots and little sticks the United States might be able to use to alter some of Pakistan's calculation, and maybe even having a continued CT relationship could give the US some influence. But I don't think it can alter the Pakistani military's fundamental calculation that India remains the greatest threat and it must be prioritized over all other things.
Well, I was hoping you could expand upon the U.S.'s relationship with India and how this you touched on it earlier, but how this kind of affects the calculus here, given who's in leadership in India right now, given the trajectory of that government, and the posture they've taken towards Pakistan in the past few years.
Yeah, well, I mean, over the past few years, there's been a few skirmishes between Pakistan and India, and of course, all of those skirmishes always have the potential, as small as it may be, of escalating into a nuclear exchange. And I think that remains one of one of the main worries of the U.S. government, which is that if there's a terrorist attack inside India and it triggers a conventional war, which we've seen these small skirmishes in the past few years, could it lead to a nuclear conflict? I think it's unlikely, but if it happened, it would be disastrous. And so U.S. policymakers are left worrying about the worst case scenarios, even though those scenarios might be unlikely because the repercussions of those scenarios would be so disastrous. Right now, relations between India and Pakistan, and that my focus is not India and Pakistan relations, but relations between those two countries is not that bad. It's not nearly as bad as it could be. It's there's been a few glimmers of hope, but I think with India, the more important thing to look at is that the Biden administration is prioritizing this Indo-Pacific strategy, this idea that India is a crucial partner in countering China. And so I think when the United States looks at India, it's looking eastward. It's not looking at Afghanistan and the rest of South Asia, for better or for worse. And so I think the focus is on China. And in some sense, that's probably what motivated the withdrawal decision, which is we're wasting time, focusing on Afghanistan when we should be focusing on the rise of China. Now, I don't think that's the correct way to look at it. I don't think transitioning from a drawn out counterinsurgency campaign for the last 20 years to an obsession with great power competition. I don't think that's the right lesson to learn, but I do think that's what is partially motivating the Biden administration. And India is obviously a part of that.
Apropos of that point, the obsession with the great power. Let's just go back to, I mean, Afghanistan is now on probably year 40, 42, 43 of essentially, you know, a rolling civil war. Will you remind people how we got into this? And by that, I mean, it was the Soviets in our response to the Soviet Union that sort of like cycled this through on some level. And are there any lessons from this essentially 40-year chapter of, you know, more or less rubbling a country?
Well, I mean, you're one of the few hosts that acknowledges that point, that this is a 40-year civil war. It's actually really uncommon for a host to know that or acknowledge that. So thank you for that, because it's
I'm old.
It's an important point. And look, I think the US role in the anti-Soviet jihad that occurred definitely destabilized Afghanistan to a degree, but I think it's important not to whitewash what the communist era, the domestic communist politics that happened in Afghanistan, because those governments were very brutal as well. Some of it's US influence, some of it's dysfunction within Afghanistan, some of it's Pakistan. It's really complex. I think the lesson to learn is that the United States, number one, cannot dictate outcomes on the ground. And it certainly can't do it by using proxies or by putting US boots on the ground. And number two, the United States should stop this pattern. It's like a pendulum where it interferes in Afghanistan and then it just withdraws completely from the region. I mean, we saw this in the 90s, and then look what happened. And so the United States is engaged in this destructive pattern where it's either hyper involved in meddling in the region or completely withdraws and then has to go back. And I think the real lesson here is that diplomacy and aid and economic development is measured in decades. You cannot dictate outcomes. Using proxies and US troops is always a quick fix that creates more problems than it resolves. There's a lot of debate right now. Max Boot just had an article basically saying, don't give up counterinsurgency, in which he basically outlines a perfect scenario where counterinsurgency could work, and says what really happened in Iraq and Afghanistan is we fell short of doing it the right way. But of course, I don't think the US government or any military would ever really be capable of doing counterinsurgency the right way. I'm willing to entertain Max Boot's argument that perhaps in some perfect vacuum of a scenario, counterinsurgency could be conducted the right way, but we don't have a good track record. And the fact that
does anybody like, I mean, does that exist in like, I mean, that is like, does it exist in anywhere other than fairy tales? That notion of like this sort of clean counterinsurgency where there's no blowback and you're not creating enemies on the ground and you're not empowering, you know, movements or groups that are going to end up being a problem 15 years from now?
Well, I certainly don't think it exists when it's a foreign power intervening to conduct the counterinsurgency. There's examples of insurgencies that have been defeated by, the co-nationalists, or perhaps Colombia is an example of that, or Sri Lanka is an example of that. Although I'm not experts in those areas, so I don't take that with a grain of salt. But I don't think there's many examples, if any, where a foreign force has imposed its will in a counterinsurgency campaign and been very successful. I'm sure there's a historian who will listen to this who will find an example, but I think those examples are so few and far between that to base policy on that fantasy, which I think you say it correctly, it is a fantasy, would be, it's foreign policy malpractice.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of the classic FU, which was the Friedman unit. When they talked about, I think it was Iraq. We just need 6 more months. That's the Friedman unit, and everything's going to be fine, named after Tom Friedman. All right, just so lastly, well, I know we just have a minute here. Are you, I mean, is is Biden, the Biden $200 million, nonetheless, that probably should be, 10 times that amount of money, maybe more. But it's so far, where are you surprised by what Biden has done? And do you think he's doing what he should be at this point?
Look, I applaud the Biden administration for withdrawing U.S. troops. I understand why they tried to engage in a Hail Mary of a diplomatic push before May 1, and they tried to get a political settlement. Although I always said that even if they did get a political settlement on paper, the vast majority of peace deals are never implemented. You can get it on paper, you can get all the warring factions into the same conference room, but good luck getting them to implement it. Especially without a third party that can enforce it. And the United States cannot be a third party that enforces a peace deal because the United States was a party to the conflict itself. It's like folks in Washington forget that. We were part of this war. We weren't some neutral party on the sideline. So I applaud the Biden administration's decision to bring US troops home. I think it's critical that aid continue because the Afghan government will just come to a grinding halt if they don't get aid. Now, it's going to be a challenge because I don't think we should be supporting the kind of corruption and cronyism that we have for the last 20 years. And that's going to require some creativity. Perhaps the United States will be able to take a harder line on aid now that there's not US troops on the ground. I think when US troops were on the ground in Afghanistan, Washington was, turning a blind eye to a lot of corruption because, well, this is who we had to work with and US lives were on the line. Now that US lives aren't on the line, maybe, they'll take a harder stance when it comes to corruption. I hope they do, but I also hope they continue the funding and don't let the perfect become the enemy of the good when it comes to conditioning aid. It will take time for, the Afghan government to get rid of the kind of corruption we've seen. And I'm not one who believes in just handing out aid willy-nilly, but in this case, I think there's somewhat of a moral responsibility to do it just because we were so much a part of the destabilization of this country. So I applaud the Biden administration so far. I hope they follow through with it. And I think what's going to be important is not to let folks like Max Boot and others whitewash the last 20 years.
Here. Adam Weinstein, research fellow at the Quincy Institute. Really appreciate your time today.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to take a break, folks. But when you hear the words Max Boot, run for the hills.
Put on your boots and run for the hills.
Exactly. These neocons have come out of the woodwork. And as far as, providing aid, I am also old enough to remember the promises that were made, if not directly to the Afghani people, but to the American people in terms of what our intentions were in Afghanistan. And we were adamant. We were not going to leave that place in ruins. It was to the extent that there was any criticism of George Bush, specifically around that, it was he had promised not to be a nation builder. And here he is saying that we're going to Afghanistan and rebuilding a nation. But yeah, that didn't quite happen. There were some improvements at least within Kabul, but $200 million, my God, that's like Jeff Bezos is like, I don't know, budget for red wine for a year or something.
Yeah, it's the
I
equivalent
don't even know if
of
he drinks a lot, but I'm sure the bottles he gets are really expensive.
It's the equivalent of us, sending a pizza.
It's crazy.